Okay, welcome to Psych 200 Research Methods. Today we're continuing our lecture on presenting your research. Okay, last time we talked about the sections of the research report. We talked about the title page, we talked about the abstract, the introduction, and the method section. Today we're going to talk about the results. We're going to talk about the discussion. We're going to talk about references. We're going to talk about tables, figures, appendices, and even how to actually present your research through a, let's say, a presentation or doing a poster. So we're going to talk about all those things. So this is where we left off. We need to talk about the results section of the APA style paper. The results, okay? It's a summary of the data and the statistical analyses, okay? So you're summarizing what you found, okay? You've calculated your means, your standard deviations, your percentages, whatever you need to do. And now you need to report what it is that your data actually shows, okay? The results section begins immediately following the method section. You don't start a new page. Please don't leave big blanks, okay? It doesn't necessarily start at the top of the page. It could, but it begins immediately after the method section, wherever the method section ended. It provides a complete and unbiased reporting of the findings, just the facts, no discussion of the findings. Sometimes students get confused about that. What that means is that in the results section, you just present the data. You talk about what the data is. You don't interpret it. You might say something like, you know, for instance, participants participants were somewhat, let's say, aggressive on average. Mean equals 3.2, standard deviation equals 1.10, something like that. And you leave it at that. You don't say anything further about that. You don't say, this shows that participants really were aggressive, and this might be because they were angry. You don't explain anything here. You just present the data, okay? And I'll show you guys an example in a moment. Actually, I already have, but I'm gonna show you that same example again. We'll talk about it a little bit more. You don't interpret, you don't guess about what's going on. You just present the results. The discussion, where you talk about what it means. The next section, the discussion section, is where you talk about what it means. Okay, and there you do try to interpret. Here you just present it. Okay, you just report it. And here's an image of the results section there. I know you can't really see that, it's small, it's just an image. But if you can see there that it says results there in bold, and it starts in the middle of the page because that's where the method section ended. Okay, and of course we can't read that. I'll show you guys an example after I stop recording, one that you can actually read. After the results section comes the discussion section. In the discussion section, again, it begins immediately after the results section. You don't start a new page, right? That's what it says at the bottom there. The discussion section restates the hypothesis. It restates your prediction or predictions. You might have had more than one. And here you summarize the results again. Again, briefly, you mention what you found, but this time you don't mention any numbers. There's no numbers mentioned in the discussion, okay? You just basically restate what you found. We found that males were more aggressive than females, for instance, as an example. And you present a discussion, you interpret the results. You talk about why, or what does it mean? This is where you can actually basically interpret. And a way to interpret, by the way, a very smart way to interpret, and what you should do if you're going to do a good job, is that you try to explain what you found based on previous research that you probably presented in the introduction of your paper. If you can link it back, right? Use previous research to explain what you found. You could say something like, this results mirrors the one by, you know, so-and-so, you know, and therefore replicates those findings, or whatever it is. You talk about the implications. What does this mean? Okay. What are some possible applications? What might it lead to? And when we talk about possible applications, that might mean, you know, things that can actually be changed, like as far as rules or laws or anything like that. But you're probably not going to get into stuff like that. But what we mean by possible applications might be in there. You might be mention more things like that have to do more with future research. Future research could look at this, this, and this, or our results are based on a survey. In the future, it would be useful to do an experiment using these same variables to see if it really, if there is some cause and effect here, something like that. Okay. This discussion section really does take some thought, and it takes a couple of pages. Okay. Now I know when you're in your 101 class or some other class, especially if you were in my 101 class, I told you it's okay to have one paragraph for your discussion. Okay. Not here. Okay. This is a real research report that you guys are writing based on real research. To tell you the truth, I'm going to be nice. Okay. A one-page discussion is enough. If you have like one page, all right, couple of paragraphs, you restate your hypothesis, briefly restate your results without any data. Okay. Without any numbers, talk about what it means, you know, in a, maybe a second paragraph, talk about what it means, possible implications, limitations of the study, future research, that kind of stuff. Okay, a couple of paragraphs might be enough, but it has to be maybe about a full page, 2 pages if you really want to do a good job. Okay, but as long as it's about a page, you're okay. Don't give me half a page. Don't give me one paragraph for this. It's supposed to require some thought, supposed to show some intelligence here. Okay, when it comes to talking about your results, and make sure that your discussion actually reflects your results, because when I read it, you could say a whole bunch of things. Okay, and I can tell if it's just a bunch of BS where you're just making stuff up. You're just, you know, bringing stuff up that has nothing to do with your data, just trying to make it seem like you thought about something and you have something written there. I'm not going to give you any credit for that. Say this has nothing to do with your results here. You are just trying to BS your way through the paper. I'm not giving you credit for that. Okay, so please give this some thought. It should be related to what you actually found. Just warning you guys about that. Let's keep going. Well, here's an image of or an example of a discussion. This one starts at the top of the page. It doesn't have to. Okay, wherever the results end is where the discussion begins. Could have been in the middle of the page. That's one page there. Could be a couple of pages. One page is enough. Okay, but one full page. Okay, not half a page, not a paragraph. Okay, this is not a Psych 101 class. Okay, that's the discussion section. And like I said, I'll show you guys an example in a moment. Other parts of the research paper, the references. Okay, the references, well, you need a list of the complete references for all the sources of information that you cited. You know, all those authors that you cited, and let's say in the introduction section of your paper. You might have had a citation also in your method section. Maybe you mentioned something like, part of the survey included the self-esteem scale by so-and-so, right? So all the people that you cited previously, they should be in the references. The references is the complete listing, you know, where you have the author's name, you have the year, you have the title, the publishing information, right? Those are the references. Okay, you need all the sources there. They're organized alphabetically by the name of the first author, and it begins a new page. The references do begin a new page. So if your discussion ends halfway down the page, then you're going to skip that half page and go right to the next page. Top of the page is where the references begin. And just to remind you about what it says on your syllabus, you need at least 5 references. You need to have cited at least 5 sources, and you need to list those same 5 sources in the references. A problem that I often see is that I see references listed in the reference section, right? I see sources listed there, and they are not the ones that were mentioned. They were not the ones that were cited. And if they weren't cited, I'm not going to give you credit for them. They say this one right here wasn't even cited. Okay, you don't get credit for that one. Or if none of them are cited, I'm just going to, you know, just put an X on the whole thing and say you don't get credit for this. None of these things were cited. Okay, you need to have the same people you cited are the same ones that should be in the reference section. Sometimes people leave things out, or they have more things in that they cited, and some of those are missing from the references. Sometimes they have things in the references that are not cited. You need to make sure that you have that correspondence there. Okay, those are the references, and there's an example of some references there. It says to, well, you can't really see that, but I'll show you the example. without outside the PowerPoint in a moment, so you can actually see it more clearly. This only has 3 sources. Your paper requires at least 5. Okay, so it's in bold there, right? It says, note this example only has 3 sources. You're required to have at least 5. And if you're missing sources, then you get less points for your references. And I think your references are worth 20 points, by the way, if I'm remembering correctly. Oh, so let's talk more about these references. How do you include a book in the references? Okay, well, you need the authors of the book. Maybe there's 1, maybe there's 2, maybe there's more, right? You need the date of publication. You need the book title. The book title should be in italics, and you need the publisher. Okay, you no longer need the publication location. So that's good news. Okay, so here's an example: Miller, comma, first initial, right? And then the year. Let me mention a problem that I see already a lot of people making. And it's just because they don't pay attention. Okay, notice author's last name, comma, space, then the initial, right, of the first name, not the first name. It should not say Miller, comma, and space Norman, for instance. No, okay, no, we don't have the full first name there. I'm going to cross that off, say the first initial only. You could put this, if they have a middle name, you could put the second initial as well, but no full names other than the last name. Okay, please do it right, or you're going to lose points. And then we have the title of the book, Understanding Depression. Notice it is italicized to emphasize that that is the source, right? That's the main source. That's the title. It starts with a capital. And please note, all the rest is lowercase. I see a problem that's very common, that most students, commit this error, right? Where they'll start the first word with a capital, the second word with a capital, the third one, if there's a third one, and on and on. Every word begins with a capital. That is wrong, okay? Only the first letter of the first word begins with the capital. All the rest is lowercase. And it takes a long time to correct that, by the way. And then when I'm trying to correct it, it messes up the alignment of your paper when I'm grading these online, and it's a pain to grade. So I'm telling you now, please don't make that mistake. And then you have the publishing company, academic press. Okay, and that's it. No publication location needed anymore. If you have an electronic book, let's say, or a book from EBSCOhost, one that you got online, you use you do it very similarly, except that you add the path. All right, a book from EBSCOhost would be like an electronic book. So you'd have the authors there, right? In this case, there's 3, right? Miller, and again we have Carlson, and we have JT. This for Carlson we have first initial and the middle initial. Then we have Newberg, first initial, middle initial, and then we have the year in which the work was published in parentheses. Then we have the title of the book, the publishing company, and then we have the path, because it came from EBSCOhost. It's an electronic source, so we need to put the path in there. If you're talking about an ebook, which could also be from EBSCOhost, right? Your ebooks are going to be from EBSCOhost, by the way. But maybe you have an ebook and you have a DOI, right? If you have an ebook, right, you can probably locate what's called the DOI, the Digital Object Identifier. You must include that in your references in the following way, okay? So the title of the author there, the year, the title of the book, the title of the book is italicized, and then the publisher, and then we have the path there, but the path here includes the DOI. It's still the path, but now it includes the DOI. Or you can just put DOI and then the numbers, if you can find it. I will caution you that sometimes when I look in EBSCOhost and I find a book there, I can't always find the DOI, okay? I can't always find this digital object identifier. Sometimes I can't find it. So I'll just put the path, okay? Which the path should be like that one right there. Okay, moving on. Book chapter. The book chapter reference is probably the most complicated one. A book chapter, you would use the book chapter method when you find a book that is, where you have editors, the people on the cover of the book, and then you have every chapter has a different author. Those are usually good books. What it means that means that every chapter has a different expert that wrote it. Okay, and the editors put it all together, put the whole book together. those are some very good books. Some of the best research-based books are gonna be that form, okay? And for that, and in that case, what you actually cited are authors of the chapter in your paper. So you need to use the book chapter method, okay? So you start with the chapter authors, not the editors, not the main authors, but the chapter authors, then the year in which the work was published, then you have the chapter title, and then you have to put in, and then whatever the title of the book, you have to put in, and then whatever the, the editors are, then the book title in italics, then the page numbers in parentheses, and then the publishing company. This one's the longest one, and it's annoying because it's like 2 references in one, okay? So you start with the example there, you start with the authors of the actual chapter, not the editors, not the book authors, but of the chapter, then the year, and then the title of the chapter, okay? Notice it starts with a capital, all the rest is lowercase, and it's not italicized here because that's the title of the chapter. And then and then you have the editors. You start with the first initial, then the last names, and you put eds if there's more than one. If there's only one, you put ed dot, right, in parentheses. And then you have the title of the book, starts with a capital, all the rest is lowercase. Then you have the page numbers in parentheses, pp dot, and then you have the publishing company. That one is annoying, okay? That one is long. Believe it or not, I learned it in graduate school. I didn't even know how to do this in undergrad. I didn't know this because no one taught us that one. There are other types of references. Like for instance, if you are going to include a journal article, a research report, these are actual studies that were published by researchers. Those you would also find in EBSCOhost. That's the source that we use, right? That's what we use to find these journal articles. Here, for those, you would use the authors, you would use the date of publication, the article title, and then you have the journal title in italics, the volume in italics, and then the page numbers. Okay, so again, you have the author's last name, the first initial, the year in which it was published in parentheses, and then you have the title of the article. Starts with a capital, all the rest is lowercase. And then you have the title of the journal. Okay, that is in italics, and for the journal, every major word is capital. Does start with a capital. So the journal title is a little bit different. And then you have a comma. Then you have the volume, and then you have a comma. The italics goes all the way until the comma after the volume. If you have a number, by the way, like it's volume 12, number 3, that would be in parentheses right next to the 12, and then you'd have the comma. And then you have the page numbers. They're not in italics, okay? The page numbers are not in italics. It doesn't say P or PP, right? And it ends with a period. That's the way that you do our journal article. If you're gonna get a journal article, a research report from EBSCOhost, it's gonna be pretty much the same, except you're gonna add the path at the end. So again, you have the authors, the year, and then you have the title of the article, and then you have the title of the journal, italicized. Every word begins with a capital there, okay? Every major word. And then you have the volume, comma, italics goes up to there. Then you have the page number, and then you have the path because it came from EBSCOhost. So this journal article method over here, technically that one, if you do it that way, it means that you actually got the thing in print. You got it in print. You actually went to the library and you found it. You found that big volume, right? And you went to those specific pages and you found the article. If you got it online, then you use this one. Okay. I think it's silly. I think it's actually dumb to basically have to add the path and differentiate whether you got it in print or online. It's exactly the same thing. But that's my opinion. I disagree with some of the rules here. And I think in the future, they'll change it. In the future, they'll get rid of that path. You'll see. Because in the future, it won't matter. Everything's going to be online. Already, we are, we're that way already. Almost everything is online already, and you can find your sources online. You don't actually have to physically go to the library. Here's an example of references. It will look different in the actual paper, okay, that you guys, when you guys do your paper, because it will be 12 font times New Roman, 1-inch margins all the way around. But this is just an example of the citations, the references that we referred to. Okay. So that was the references. Okay, I told you what the references are, and I told you how to do them. Now let's talk about an appendix. Some of you might have an appendix. If you have a very long survey that you are referring to, like in your method section, right? And you have something like, we have 5 questions about this, this, and this. We have 5 questions about this, and other questions about this and that. And, you have a long survey. You might want to say, see appendix, A, for the complete survey. So they can see the questions or the items word for word, okay, and the scales, okay. If you have something that's simple, you can describe all the questions. It's not a big deal. You don't need an appendix. But some of you might need an appendix, especially if you have a scale. We use Rosenberg's 1963, self-esteem scale. Please see Appendix A. Some examples of items on the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, included this and this. Please see Appendix A for a complete list of the items or of the questions. So appendices present detailed information, okay? Because you don't want to go on and on, right, for pages, let's say, describing a survey, a questionnaire. So you might want to just describe some of the items, or the types of items, examples of each type, right? And then say, see appendix. Appendices are useful, okay? But would interrupt the flow of information if they're presented in the body of the paper. So they're not presented in the body of the paper, they're presented at the end, okay? After the references. It says refer to table 16.3. Okay, we're not using that textbook anymore. Don't refer to that table, okay? We don't have that table, but I'm gonna tell you what you need to know about appendices anyway. And there's an example of an appendix, okay? Basically, I know that it's hard to see, but I'll show you the paper after the recording. But yes, there's a certain questionnaire there. It has all the questions, all the scales, and you can see how describing all of that would just take too long in the method section. Too much detail. You would kind of lose the flow of the paper. So you would describe some of them, and then mention the appendix. If you do not say in your paper, see Appendix A or something like that, then I expect that you have described all your questions, all your items. Maybe not in detail, but you have at least said, we had questions that asked about this and this and this, or we have questions about this, this, and this, right? And you describe all of them, okay? But if you only describe a couple, it better say, see appendix for the full description. Tables and figures. Tables and figures also go after the references. Okay. Now I presented the appendices first because in the example that I'm going to show you guys, there are no tables and figures. I don't actually want to see any tables and figures for your paper. Okay. Your paper is not going to be that complicated where you need tables and figures. But the order would be after the references. Usually you would have tables first, and then figures, and then appendices. Okay. But I described the appendices first because that's all we have in the example. You could also have tables and figures, okay? As a general rules, tables and figures supplement the text, okay? So they provide additional information. They don't duplicate the information that's already been presented in the text by form. You might have a table that, that mentions certain things. If you already describe that, let's say, if you describe that in your results section, you don't need that table. Maybe you have, for instance, a bunch of correlations, and you only mention a few in the results. Let's say you only mention the ones that were significant, the ones that were large enough to matter. And there were a whole bunch of others. You could say, all other correlations were non-significant. See table 1 for, for all correlations, something like that. Okay. So if you describe everything that's in the table, you don't need the table, okay? If you only describe some things in the table and you leave out a bunch of other things, then you might need the table. But you guys, I don't really want to see any tables. You guys don't have anything that complicated, okay? A table or figure should be mentioned in the text by number. You should refer to it see table 1, see figure 1, something like that. See table 2, see figure 2, right? The text should point out some of the more important aspects of the figure or table. You point out some things that are on there, not all of them. That's why you mentioned see table 1, see figure 1. Each table or figure is on a new page, even if it's small, even if it's a small table. If it's table 1, right? Even if it's small, it has its own page. Table 2, even if it's small, would have its own page, right? You don't try to cram several of them on one page. Same thing with figures, whether they're small, or large, or they take up a lot of space, depending on how complicated they are. They all have their own page. Here's an example of a table. You can see that's not very large, right? I know you can't really read that because it's just an image on a PowerPoint, but they would say table 1, and even though there's a lot of blank space, that's okay. It uses up only as much space as it needs. And then if there's another table, it would be on the next page. Here's an example of a figure. Okay. You can see that there's space left over. If you need another figure, that would go on another page. Okay, that's it for talking about the actual research report. Now let's talk about how you might present this. Okay, you can do how you can do presentations. That's what we're going to talk about. You can do what are called paper presentations and poster presentations. Okay. By the way, you can also just publish your paper. By the way, you can try to publish it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But let's say you attend a conference and you're going to present your work. You can do so as a paper presentation, or you can do so as a poster presentation. In order to, of course, get accepted to do a presentation in the conference, you have to first submit a written summary or an abstract to the conference organizers for approval. You first have to submit, a summary of your paper, a summary of your work, right? Your research study, or an abstract, which is also a summary, to the conference organizers, and then they'll decide whether they want to give you time to present yours. There are alternative methods for presenting a research report. Okay, there's 2 ways you can do this. Okay, you can do an oral presentation where you actually do a PowerPoint presentation for about 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how much time you're given, or you can do what's called a poster presentation, where you basically you staple or glue certain sections of your study onto a poster with larger font, not 12 font, larger font, and you stand by your poster basically and let people come around and look at it, and then ask you questions. So that one for the poster presentation, that's a lot less pressure. You stand there next to your poster, people look at it. If they have questions, they ask you. They may have questions, they may not. Oral presentation, you're giving a presentation to an audience, and they will ask you questions at the end. That's more stressful, especially if it's your first time. Submitting a manuscript for publication. Okay, what about if you're just going to publish the thing, right? Did a research study and you want to try to publish it. For this class, you're not really going to try to publish it, okay? What you guys are doing, believe it or not, is basically very simple. It's not really worth publishing. It could be very useful information. It could be interesting, but it's not good enough. What you guys are doing now is not good enough to be published, okay? This is an introductory class. When you go to graduate school and you learn how things are really done, right, in more detail, it'll be a lot more rigorous, right? Then you'll produce things that are probably worthy of publication, or maybe still not worthy of publication. It depends. Okay, now submitting a manuscript for publication, right? If you want to submit your work for publication, what do you have to do? You have to select the journal, right, that is appropriate for the topic of your research report. Remember those journals that you might have referred to in your paper, right? Where certain, articles are published, right? Yeah, those are journals, okay? And if you want your work to be published, you're going to submit to a journal. And what they do is they put several of these together, and a whole bunch of them together will make up a volume of that journal. Like volume 1 would be the very first volume, the very first set of studies that they published. It might be for a certain year. The next year, they might have volume 2, and so on. Okay, so you will submit you can submit your manuscript or your work basically for publication. Consult the journal's instructions, to the to authors for specific submission requirements. So you can actually look inside the journal. Okay, there's certain pages in the journal, you know, at the beginning of the volume that mention basically what you should do if you want to submit something for potential publication. They won't necessarily just accept it, by the way. Not everything gets accepted. They will pick and choose some. They'll leave out others for various reasons. Okay. You also have to enclose a cover letter to the journal editor along with the manuscript. A cover letter where you talk about that you want your paper to be published in their journal, whatever it is. You identify yourself and say, here's my my research report, right? Here's my work. Take a look at it. Tell me what you think if you want to publish it. And what usually happens is they the editors will basically gather up these submissions, and it's not going to be one. There's going to be many, and they're going to review them in a group. They're going to talk about them like in a group of 10 people are all going to read it, and they're going to get together at a meeting, and they're going to talk about this research report, what's wrong with it, what they like about it, what they don't like about it, and they'll decide if it should be published or not, or if they should send it back, ask for corrections before they publish it, or if they just reject it, and they'll look at another one, and and that's what they do to decide if something is worthy of publication. And journals that are more prestigious have basically higher standards for publication. There are some that are easier to get your work published in, and some that are very difficult or almost impossible. Okay. There is also something else known as a research proposal. A research proposal is something you write in order to get funding, to get money to do the study. Research does cost money, okay? And that's why you write a proposal, okay? So a research proposal is also a written report, okay? But you haven't done the work yet, okay? So you present the plan and the underlying rationale of a future research study. So you want to do a certain study, you want to get some funding for it, you want to get some money for it, let's say from the government or from the state or whatever it is. There's several funding sources. And you're going to write this research proposal. You're going to include a review of the relevant background literature. You're going to have an introduction, basically, where you're going to make an argument, let's say for your study, about why it should be done. You're going to have an explanation of how the proposed study, the study that you want to do, is related to other research that's already been done. You're going to have a description of the planned research, what you plan to do. You're going to describe your method section. You plan to do this, this, and this, right? And you're not really going to have a result section, but you're going to have a description of the possible results. This is what we expect to find. So it's similar to writing a research report. It's similar to writing, a research report, after you do an actual study. It's similar, right? You still follow APA guidelines. You still cite the same way, right? However, you will use future tense to describe your own study because it hasn't been done yet. You guys, when you write yours, by the way, your study should be done by the time you write your paper. You need to use past tense, except, of course, remember, except in the discussion. This discussion section, use present tense. But for when you're writing a research report, something you plan to do in the future, you need to use future tense. Other differences, an abstract is optional. Often you don't have an abstract. The work hasn't been done, so you can't really summarize it. You don't really need to do that. The literature review in the introduction is usually more extensive. It's longer because you need to make a good argument for why your study should be funded, why you should do that work, right? And you can have a combined results and discussion section. You can have predicted results and discussion within the same section. So it's a little bit different than a research report, but it's mostly similar. And that's it, you guys. So I will stop recording.